In Silicon Valley, there is one rule above all others: fake it until you make it. Pretend the product works. Pretend you are the next Steve Jobs, until one day you actually are. Elizabeth Holmes understood that rule better than anyone. She built a $9 billion company on a single promise, a promise that was never true. And she convinced some of the most powerful people in the world to believe her. For more than a decade, she got away with it, until the lies started killing people. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. Her family was upper middle class. Her father worked for government agencies, including USAID and Enron. From an early age, Holmes was obsessed with one idea: becoming a billionaire. At 9 years old, she wrote a letter to her father listing her goals. At the top, "I want to be a billionaire, not a doctor, not a scientist, a billionaire." It was the foundation of everything that followed. Holmes enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. She was brilliant and intensely driven. But she was also deeply afraid of needles and blood draws, a phobia that would, ironically, become the seed of her entire empire. In 2003, at just 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She took her tuition money, $50,000, and used it to found a company called Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Her vision was revolutionary, a device that could run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick. No needles, no syringes, fast, cheap, and available to everyone. If it worked, it would transform medicine. Doctors could detect cancer, diabetes, and heart disease earlier than ever before. Patients in remote areas could access lab testing without a hospital. It was the kind of idea that changed the world. The problem was simple and devastating. It didn't work. The technology never worked. Not in 2003, not in 2010, not ever. But Holmes had something more powerful than working technology. She had a story, and she knew exactly how to tell it. She studied Steve Jobs obsessively. She adopted his uniform, the black turtleneck. She copied his presentation style. She lowered her voice to a deep, authoritative baritone, a voice that, according to people who knew her from childhood, was completely fabricated. She spoke in a way that made people feel they were witnessing history. And the most powerful people in America believed her. George Shultz, former Secretary of State; Henry Kissinger, former National Security Advisor; James Mattis, future Secretary of Defense; Rupert Murdoch, Larry Ellison. They all invested. They all believed. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes was worth an estimated $4.5 billion, making her the youngest female self-made billionaire in history. Magazine covers, speaking tours, a TED Talk. The world celebrated her as a visionary. But inside Theranos, a very different reality existed. The Edison machine, the proprietary device Holmes claimed could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, could actually only run a small number of tests accurately. And even those results were unreliable. For the vast majority of tests, Theranos was secretly using conventional laboratory machines from other companies, the same machines used by every other lab in the country. They would dilute the tiny finger prick sample, and run it through standard equipment, then present the results as if they had come from their revolutionary technology. The results were wildly inaccurate. Patients received false positives for HIV, false positives for cancer, incorrect readings that sent people into panic, or worse, gave them false reassurance when they were actually sick. Inside the company, scientists and engineers who raised concerns were fired or silenced. Holmes and her partner, Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny, created a culture of fear and absolute secrecy. Employees were forbidden from talking to each other about what they were working on. The lab was locked. Questions were not tolerated. One of those employees was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz, one of Theranos' most prominent board members. Tyler joined the company believing in the mission. What he found horrified him. He discovered that Theranos was manipulating quality control data, falsifying the numbers that demonstrated the accuracy of their tests. When he raised his concerns internally, Holmes dismissed him. When he went to his grandfather, George Schultz sided with Holmes over his own family. Tyler Schultz eventually contacted the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the government agency that regulates medical labs. It was one of the first cracks in the wall. The man who would bring down Theranos was not a regulator or a rival. He was a journalist. John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal spent months investigating Theranos, speaking to former employees under conditions of extreme secrecy. When Carreyrou called Holmes for comment, she responded not with transparency, but with an army of lawyers. Theranos threatened sources, filed legal actions, did everything possible to kill the story before it published. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's investigation. The headline was simple and devastating: "A prized startup's struggles." It revealed that Theranos' technology was fundamentally flawed, and that the company had been misleading investors, partners, and patients for years. Holmes went on television. She called the story false. She doubled down. She claimed the company's technology was working, and that Carreyrou had been deceived by disgruntled former employees. For a brief moment, some people believed her, but the regulators had already begun to move. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted an inspection of Theranos' lab and found it posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In July 2016, they banned Holmes from operating medical labs for 2 years and moved to revoke Theranos' laboratory certification. Walgreens, which had partnered with Theranos to offer blood testing in its stores, terminated the partnership. Partners Pharmacy did the same. The contracts that had made Theranos worth $9 billion began to collapse, one by one. In June 2018, Theranos dissolved. The company that had been valued at $9 billion, that had promised to revolutionize medicine, was worth nothing. Holmes voided her shares rather than face a legal battle with investors. In June 2018, the Department of Justice indicted Holmes and Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The charges alleged they had knowingly deceived investors, doctors, and patients for years. Holmes and Balwani were tried separately. Balwani's trial came first. He was convicted on all 12 counts in 2022 and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. Holmes's trial was a media spectacle. She sat in court, projecting calm, the same composure she had used for years to convince the world she was a visionary. Her defense argued she had genuinely believed in the technology, that she was a victim of bad science, not a perpetrator of fraud. The jury did not believe her. In January 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 3 counts of wire fraud against investors, and 1 count of conspiracy. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a minimum security prison in Texas in May 2023 to begin serving her sentence. Her appeal was denied in February 2024. In January 2025, she filed for presidential clemency. As of now, Elizabeth Holmes remains in federal prison. The damage she left behind was real and human. Patients who received false cancer diagnoses lived through terror and unnecessary treatments. Patients who received false reassurances delayed seeking real care. Some of those delays may have cost lives. Investors lost hundreds of millions. The total amount raised by Theranos under false pretenses exceeded $700 million from some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. What made the Theranos story different from Enron or Madoff was the medium of the deception. Holmes didn't manipulate accounting books. She manipulated something more powerful, the human desire to believe in a better future. She understood that people don't just invest in products. They invest in stories, in visions, in the idea that one person can change the world. And she weaponized that belief with devastating precision. The board that was supposed to oversee her was filled with powerful men who were dazzled by her charisma and blinded by their own egos. They didn't ask hard questions because they didn't want to be the ones who failed to recognize the next Steve Jobs. In the end, Elizabeth Holmes was not the next Steve Jobs. She was something far more dangerous. A person who understood the psychology of power better than the people who held it. And she used that understanding to build a billion-dollar lie on a foundation of blood that was never tested, results that were never real, and a future that was never coming. The ledger of Theranos was always empty. $9 billion of value, built on a single drop of blood that told the world exactly what it wanted to hear. Subscribe to Shadow Ledger. Every week, we open a new ledger, and the numbers never lie.